Michael Carter signed the divorce papers with a smirk. Not a nervous smile, not a polite gesture. A smirk the kind that says, "I already won." He leaned across the table, looked his wife of 8 years directly in the eyes, and said the words that would one day destroy him. "Without me, you are nothing. You were nothing before me, and you will be nothing after me." Emily Harper did not cry. She did not argue. She simply picked up the pen, signed her name, and walked out of that courtroom carrying one old suitcase and a silence so deep it shook the walls. That silence, it was not weakness. It was the calm before a storm no one saw coming. Welcome, friends. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in because this one is going to stay with you for a long time. The morning of the divorce, Michael Carter woke up feeling like a man who had just conquered the world. He stretched out in the king-sized bed of the downtown Chicago hotel where he had been staying for the past 3 weeks, ever since his lawyer advised him to move out of the family home to make the legal process smoother. He ordered room service. He called his girlfriend Vanessa, a 29-year-old marketing consultant he had met at a business conference 11 months earlier. He told her it was finally done. "It's over." Vanessa's voice was bright, almost giddy. "Signed, sealed, delivered," Michael said, swirling the orange juice in his glass like it was champagne. "By this time next year, we'll be living in that house in Winnetka, the one you picked out." "What about Emily? Did she fight for anything?" Michael laughed. And the laugh, it was not just casual, it was dismissive. The laugh of a man who had already decided another person's value before she even opened her mouth. "She didn't fight for anything," he said. "She barely even looked up when she signed. You know what she's like, quiet, passive, always just there, like furniture." Vanessa made a sound of vague sympathy, which was really just polite agreement. "She'll be fine," Michael continued. "She's got some savings, she can get a job somewhere, maybe retail, maybe a coffee shop, I don't know. That's not my problem anymore." He paused, then added, "And this is the part that would come back to haunt him. The truth is, Vanessa Emily never really had anything before she met me. And she's leaving with just about the same." There was a silence on the phone, not a meaningful one, just the small silence of a woman who had no reason to argue because she had no reason to care about Emily Harper either. "Come celebrate tonight?" Vanessa asked. "Absolutely," Michael said. And he hung up the phone without a single second of hesitation. That is who Michael Carter was on the morning of his divorce. A man so certain of his own version of reality that he had stopped checking whether it was actually true. A man who had spent 8 years living next to a woman he never once truly looked at. And that was his greatest mistake. Because the woman he had just dismissed as furniture, she had been the foundation of his entire house. Emily Harper was 38 years old on the day she walked out of that courtroom. She wore a plain gray blazer, dark slacks, and flat shoes. No jewelry, except for small pearl earrings her grandmother had given her. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was composed. To anyone in that room who didn't know her, and honestly even to those who thought they did, she looked like a woman who had lost. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. She looked like someone who would quietly disappear and never be heard from again. That impression was, of course, entirely intentional. Emily had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the art of being underestimated. She grew up in Evanston, Illinois, the daughter of a high school math teacher and a librarian. Neither of her parents were wealthy, but both were brilliant, and they raised their only daughter to value precision over performance, substance over spectacle. From the time she was 12 years old, Emily had a gift for numbers, not just arithmetic, but patterns. She could look at a financial report and see what wasn't written there. She could read a market trend the way other people read a novel, not just for what it said, but for what it was setting up 3 chapters ahead. By the time she graduated from Northwestern with a degree in economics and a minor in mathematics, 3 different investment firms had already made her offers. She turned down 2 of them because the company culture wasn't right. The third one, a boutique fund based in Chicago called Harlow Capital, suited her perfectly. She was 23 years old. Within 18 months, she had generated more return on investment for her clients than any analyst the firm had seen in a decade. She was not flashy about it. She did not throw parties or post about her wins. She simply did the work, went home, read books, and showed up the next morning. That was when she met Michael. He came into Harlow Capital as a potential client, a young entrepreneur with a tech startup that had interesting bones but serious financial problems. He was charming. He was enthusiastic. He had the kind of energy that fills a room and makes everyone around him feel like they're on the edge of something exciting. Emily saw through the charm almost immediately, but she was curious about the business. She ran the numbers. She saw something salvageable. And somehow in the process of explaining to Michael exactly why his current financial model would bankrupt him within 2 years, she also fell in love with him. She would spend the next 8 years wondering how she let that happen. Michael was the kind of man who loved being loved. He was affectionate and funny, and when things were good, he made you feel like you were the only person on earth. But when things got hard, and in a marriage things always get hard, eventually Michael didn't lean in. He deflected, he minimized, he found someone or something to blame, so he never had to sit with his own discomfort. In the early years, Emily excused it. She told herself he was under pressure. She told herself he would grow. She told herself that love was patient, and she was a patient person. She never stopped loving him. She just slowly, quietly came to understand that love was not enough to save something that only one person was trying to hold together. 6 months after their wedding, Michael's startup hit a wall. A serious wall. His lead investor pulled out after a disagreement over the direction of the company. Payroll was coming up. 2 of his key developers were threatening to walk. Michael sat at the kitchen table one Sunday night, his head in his hands, and said he didn't know if he could save it. Emily made him tea. She sat across from him. She listened to every detail, and then quietly, without drama, she said, "I have some money set aside. We can use it to bridge the gap while you renegotiate with smaller investors." "How much?" Michael asked. "Enough," she said. It was $240,000. It was nearly everything she had saved in her years at Harlow Capital. She handed it over without a contract, without a repayment plan, without even a conversation about it being a loan rather than a gift, because she believed in the marriage, and because she believed that what helped him helped them both. Michael said, "I'll pay you back. I promise." He never did. What he did do was stabilize the company, hire 2 new developers, and within 8 months land a second round of funding that tripled the company's valuation. He was thrilled. He talked about it at dinner parties. He took credit in interviews. He became in his own mind the hero of his own story. Emily was happy for him. She really was. She had also by that point quietly left Harlow Capital and started something of her own. She never told Michael the details. Not because she was hiding anything, she would have answered any question he asked, but because Michael never asked. He was interested in his own work in the way that people sometimes get interested in themselves completely and without much room left over for anyone else. Emily's venture was small at first. A consulting arrangement with 2 different private equity firms who valued her analytical skills. She worked from home mostly in the evenings after dinner, sometimes in the early mornings before Michael was awake. She billed under a company she had registered quietly 3 years into the marriage, a Delaware LLC called RHG Strategies. Nobody at the dinner table knew what RHG stood for. Rose Harper Group. Her name. The name she had before Michael. The name she had always carried in the private corners of herself. By year 5 of their marriage, RHG Strategies had grown into something no longer small. Emily had taken on 4 employees, all remote, all anonymous, so far as Michael's social circle was concerned. She had facilitated the acquisition of 2 mid-sized tech firms. She had helped structure a cross-border investment deal that made a Canadian pension fund $80 million. She had become, in certain very specific and very private circles, exactly the kind of financial mind that people didn't talk about publicly because people like Emily preferred it that way. She was building something real, something with architecture and intention and a vision that extended years into the future. Michael was building too, but he was building the way people build when they're focused on how it looks from the outside, fast, shiny, and with too little attention to the structure underneath. In year 6, Michael's company ran into trouble again. Not catastrophic trouble, but serious enough. A product launch had failed. A major contract had fallen through at the last minute. He came home one evening tighter than usual, sharper in the small ways that Emily had learned to read, clipped responses, avoidance of eye contact, more time on his phone. She did not push. She waited. 3 days later, he told her the number. Roughly 400,000 needed within 60 days, or they would have to start cutting people. Emily opened her laptop that same evening. She made 2 calls the next morning. By Thursday of that week, the money had been transferred through an investment vehicle that on paper looked like a third-party bridge loan from a holding company that no one would ever trace back to Emily Harper. She had structured it that way on purpose, not to deceive Michael, but to protect his pride. She had learned by then that when a man like Michael received help, he needed to believe the help had come from somewhere impersonal. From the market, from luck, from the universe, anywhere but from his wife. He came home Thursday evening lighter, more relaxed. He said the loan had come through. He said it was a great deal better terms than expected. He did not ask where it came from. She did not tell him. She sat across from him at dinner and watched him eat with renewed confidence, and she felt something she could not quite name, something between love and grief. Something like the feeling of being very close to a person and very far away from them at the same time. That was the night she understood deep in the part of herself where the truest things live that this marriage had a ceiling, that she was giving everything to something that would never grow to meet her. She did not file for divorce. Not then. She waited 2 more years. In year 7. Michael began changing in ways that were harder to ignore. He started attending more events without her saying it was networking, and she wouldn't enjoy it. He started being less careful with his phone. He started looking at her with the particular kind of patience that isn't patience at all, it's tolerance. The patience of someone waiting for a situation to end. Emily said nothing. She watched. She also, during that same year, began restructuring RHG Strategies into something larger. She brought on a silent partner, a seasoned investor named Gerald Cho, who had been following her work for 2 years and whose enthusiasm for what she was building was the most validating thing anyone had said to her in a long time. Together they incorporated a new parent entity, a holding company. They called it Northvale International. The name came from a street in Evanston where Emily had grown up around the corner from her childhood home. A street that meant nothing to anyone else. A street that meant everything to her. She did not tell Michael, not because she was being cruel or strategic, but because she already knew by that point that the marriage was ending, and she wanted what she had built to belong fully and completely to herself when it did. In year 8, she found the texts. She did not go looking for them. Michael had left his phone on the kitchen counter, and it lit up with a message while she was standing right there. She did not snoop. She simply saw, and what she saw was enough. She hired a lawyer the following morning. The divorce took 4 months. Michael's legal team pushed hard for financial disclosures, and Emily cooperated fully, but RHG Strategies and Northvale International were structured in ways that were entirely legitimate and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know specifically where to look. Michael's lawyers didn't know where to look. Michael himself had no idea these entities existed. He thought Emily's income was modest consulting work. He thought her assets were minimal. His legal team accepted the limited financial disclosure without suspicion. And so when Michael Carter walked out of that courtroom smirking, believing he had won, believing he had left Emily with almost nothing, what he actually did was hand a woman with a $12 billion empire her complete and unconditional freedom. On the steps of the courthouse, Emily's lawyer squeezed her shoulder and said, "You handled that with remarkable calm." Emily smiled a real smile, small and private. "I've had practice," she said. Then she got into a car, not a cab, not a rideshare, a sleek black town car driven by a man who had been employed by Northvale International for 2 years, whose job it was to make sure Emily got where she needed to go without inconvenience. She looked out the window as the courthouse disappeared behind her. She did not look back. There was nothing to look back at. The life she was driving toward was the one she had been building in silence for years, and it was waiting for her solid and real, and hers in a way that no life she had shared with Michael Carter had ever been. Michael, meanwhile, was on the phone with Vanessa planning a celebration dinner. He chose a restaurant he had been to with Emily once, a place she had loved. He did not notice the irony, or maybe he did notice on some level and enjoyed it. That kind of pettiness was not beyond him. He ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than Emily's monthly grocery budget used to be. He told Vanessa he was finally free. He told her the future was theirs. He genuinely believed it. That more than anything else is what makes this story what it is. Not that Emily was powerful. Not that Michael was wrong. But that Michael was so completely, so entirely, so catastrophically sure of himself, and so absolutely certain that the woman sitting across from him in that courtroom had nothing, that he never once stopped to ask a single question. He never asked who she was before he met her. He never asked where the bridge loan had come from in year 6. He never asked why, in 8 years of marriage, his wife had never once seemed afraid of the future. He never asked because the answer had never occurred to him. And some answers, once they do occur to you, cannot be unfound. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Northvale International announced the formation of a new technology investment division. The press release, distributed quietly to a list of selected financial journalists, described the division as the culmination of nearly a decade of strategic groundwork by a founder who had until now preferred to operate outside the public eye. The release included no photo. It included no biography. It included only a name: Emily Rose Harper. In the offices of certain private equity firms, that name produced a reaction somewhere between reverence and disbelief, because Emily Harper, Rose Harper, to those who knew her by her working name, was not an unknown. She was known very well. She was known as someone whose judgment you trusted absolutely, whose presence in a deal meant the deal was sound, whose silence meant more than most people's speeches. Michael saw the press release. Someone forwarded it to him, a mutual acquaintance who probably thought Michael would be proud. He read the name. He read it again. And then he sat very still for a very long time. He thought about the 4 months of divorce proceedings during which he had felt so sure he held all the cards. He thought about the smirk. He thought about what he had said to his lawyer. "Without me, she's nothing." He set the press release down. He picked up his phone. He started to call Emily. Then he stopped, put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. He sat like that for 40 minutes. He did not make the call, not yet, because Michael Carter was not yet ready to understand what had happened. Understanding would require humility. He hadn't practiced in years. It would require him to look at the story he had been telling himself about his marriage and admit that story was wrong, not just slightly off, not just missing a few details, but fundamentally completely wrong. That kind of reckoning takes time. And it takes a moment, a specific, undeniable, unavoidable moment when the story you've been telling simply cannot survive contact with reality. That moment was coming. It was coming in 3 months in a ballroom in Manhattan under the kind of lights that leave no shadows. And when it came, nothing would be the same for either of them. 3 weeks had passed since the divorce was finalized, and Michael Carter had already redecorated the house. Not renovated, redecorated. There is a difference. Renovation takes time and intention. What Michael did was faster and more telling. He walked through every room and removed anything that looked like Emily. Her books from the living room shelves, the framed watercolor print she had bought at a street market in Prague on their 5th anniversary, the small ceramic bowl she kept on the kitchen counter for keys and loose change. He put it all in boxes, told himself he was making a fresh start, and replaced everything with the kind of minimalist, expensive, aggressively modern furniture that Vanessa preferred. He stood in the middle of the living room afterward and looked around at what he had made and felt satisfied. That satisfaction lasted about a week. Because here is the thing about filling a space with new objects: it does not change what the space remembers. And Michael Carter's house, no matter how many clean lines and chrome surfaces, he filled it with remembered Emily Harper in every corner. Remembered her in the way the kitchen light hit the counter at 6 in the morning. Remembered her in the particular quiet of a Sunday afternoon. Remembered her not with warmth, but with the specific and uncomfortable silence of an absence that had never really been named correctly. Michael didn't recognize what he was feeling as loss. He told himself it was adjustment. He told himself it was transition. He told himself that any discomfort was temporary, a normal part of moving from one chapter to the next. He was very good at telling himself things. Meanwhile, 3 miles across the city, Emily Rose Harper was not adjusting to anything. She was executing. The morning after the divorce was finalized, she had taken exactly 30 minutes to sit in her new apartment, a clean, well-lit space she had leased under the name of a property management company that had no visible connection to her, and allow herself to feel whatever needed to be felt. She sat with a cup of tea. She looked out the window. She breathed. Then she opened her laptop. The first email she sent that morning was to Gerald Cho. "We move to phase 3, she wrote. "Timeline as discussed. Start with the New York announcement." Gerald responded in 11 minutes. "Already drafted. Review by end of day." "By noon," Emily replied. That was the entire exchange. That was all it took. Because Emily and Gerald had been planning phase 3 for 14 months. Every detail had been thought through, stress-tested, revised. The only thing that had been waiting was the moment Emily was legally free to step out of the shadow she had chosen and stand in her own light. That moment had arrived. Gerald Cho was 57 years old, a former hedge fund manager from San Francisco who had spent 30 years watching the financial world underestimate people who didn't look or sound like the majority of people in powerful rooms. He had first encountered Emily's work 4 years earlier through a mutual contact in the private equity world and had spent the following 2 years trying to get a meeting with her. When she finally agreed to one, a 45-minute call on a Tuesday afternoon, he had walked away from it convinced he had just spoken to one of the most precise financial minds of her generation. He had said as much to his wife that evening. His wife had said, "So why isn't she famous?" Gerald had thought about that for a long time. The answer he eventually understood was that Emily had made a choice, the choice to remain invisible. And that choice made inside a marriage that could not have survived her visibility had cost her years of recognition she was more than entitled to. He never said this to Emily directly. He didn't need to. They understood each other. What he did say on the day they incorporated Northvale International was this: "When you're ready, the world is going to have to do some serious recalibrating." Emily had smiled at that, not the small private smile she gave when she was managing someone else's expectations. A real one, full and unguarded. "Good," she had said. "It's overdue." Now phase 3 was in motion, and phase 3 in simple terms meant that Emily Rose Harper was done being invisible. The announcement went out quietly. No press conference, no fanfare. A single well-crafted press release to a curated list of financial journalists, followed by a private briefing for 4 of the most influential investors in the country. People who had worked with Northvale in its anonymous phase and were now being invited to understand who they had actually been working with all along. The briefings were Gerald's idea. Emily had resisted at first. "They'll feel manipulated," she said, finding out now that the person they trusted was someone they might have dismissed if they'd known from the start. "That's exactly the point," Gerald said. "Let them sit with that discomfort. Let them feel what it means to have had access to the best financial mind they've ever worked with and not even known it because of a set of assumptions they never examined." Emily considered that. "You want them to reckon with their own bias," she said. "I want them to reckon with it and still choose to move forward," Gerald said. "Because they will. Because they're smart enough to know that what matters is the result. And the results have been extraordinary." He was right. The briefings went exactly as he predicted. The first investor, a 72-year-old Boston-based real estate magnate named Hargrove, who had worked with Northvale for 3 years without ever knowing the founder's identity, sat across the table from Emily for 2 minutes in complete silence after Gerald made the introduction. Then he leaned forward, extended his hand, and said, "I've been in this business for 46 years. I have never had a better partner. It is a genuine honor to finally know your name." Emily shook his hand. She said, "The honor has been mine." She meant it. The second investor was more complicated. A younger man, mid-40s, from a new money tech family in California. He had always been slightly more aggressive in his dealings with Northvale, slightly more inclined to push back, slightly more comfortable taking up space in conversations. When he learned the identity of the architect, his first response was a laugh. Not a mean laugh, a surprised one. But he caught himself immediately because he was smart enough to realize what that laugh revealed about him. I'm sorry," he said, pressing his fingers to his forehead. "I had assumptions. I had a lot of assumptions, and I'm sitting here realizing how completely wrong they were." "Most people do," Emily said, calmly, without accusation, just truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Emily said. "How did you do it? How did you build all of this without anyone knowing, without anyone seeing you?" Emily looked at him steadily. "People see what they expect to see," she said. "I simply never corrected their expectations. It was easier than you'd think." That answer stayed with him. He brought it up at the end of the meeting when he committed to doubling his investment in Northvale's new technology division. Back in Chicago, Michael Carter was having a very different kind of week. His company, the The same company. Emily had twice pulled back from the edge of collapse, was showing signs of strain again. Not a crisis yet. Not the kind of emergency that required late-night calls to emergency investors. But strain. A key contract renewal was stalling. A competitor had moved into the market space that Michael had been planning to expand into. Two of his senior developers had left for other offers, and replacements were proving harder to find than expected. Michael was not panicking. Not yet. But he was working harder than usual, spending more time at the office, coming home to Vanessa in a mood that she had not seen before, and that she was not, if he was being honest with himself, handling particularly graciously. Vanessa was excellent company when things were good. She was less excellent company when things required patience. "You're stressed," she said one evening, watching him stare at his laptop screen across the dining room table. "I'm working," he said. "You're always working." "That's how companies grow, Vanessa." There was a pause, not a comfortable one. "Emily never complained about your hours," she said. It was not meant kindly. It was the kind of comparison that people make when they are losing an argument they didn't know they were in, and Michael recognized it immediately. He also recognized, with a flicker of something he refused to name, that Vanessa was right. Emily had never complained about his hours. She had never complained about much of anything, actually. She had simply been there, steady and quiet, and he had taken that steadiness for granted so completely that he had confused it with simplicity. He closed the laptop. "Don't compare yourself to Emily," he said. "That's not fair to either of you." Vanessa said nothing. He went to bed. Neither of them slept particularly well. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Michael heard Emily's name for the second time since the press release. I was having lunch with his old friend and business associate Derek Marsh, who ran a mid-sized venture capital firm on Michigan Avenue. Derek was one of those men who seemed to exist in permanent motion, always moving between meetings and conversations and deals, always with one ear to the ground for what was happening in the financial world before it became public knowledge. Derek sat across from Michael at their usual table, ordered his usual sandwich, and said without preamble, "Tell me about Emily." Michael looked up from his menu. "What? Your ex-wife, Emily Harper. Tell me about her." The way he said it was not casual. It was the specific tone Derek used when he was trying to appear casual about something that was not casual at all. Michael set down the menu. "Why?" "Because," Derek said, leaning forward slightly, "I just found out that the woman I have been trying to get a meeting with for 2 years, the woman behind a holding company that has quietly made some of the best investment moves in the last decade, is your ex-wife." Michael was very still. "What holding company?" he said. "Northvale International," Derek said. "You've heard of it." "I've heard the name," Michael said carefully. "The architect," Derek said. "That's what people in certain circles have been calling the founder. No name, no photo, no interviews, no public presence whatsoever. Just results. Consistently extraordinary results. I had a contact who worked with them 2 years ago. I tried to get an introduction and was told the founder wasn't taking new meetings. That's how exclusive this operation has been." Derek paused. "It's Emily. Emily Rose Harper. Did you know?" The table between them felt very wide. "No," Michael said. "I didn't know." Derek looked at him for a long moment. "She never mentioned it." "No." "In 8 years of marriage." "No, Derek, she didn't." Michael's voice was flat, controlled, the way his voice got when he was managing something he could not afford to let out in public. Derek sat back. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. "She's announcing a new technology investment division," he said finally. "Major capital, major scope. There's a gala next month in New York, one of those big charity events where the real business happens in the room, and I'm told she's going to make her first public appearance as the founder. First time anyone in those circles is going to see her face and match it to the name." He paused again. "I think you should be there." Michael laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Why would I go to an event where my ex-wife is going to be announced as what, a business icon? Why would I subject myself to that?" "Because," Derek said carefully, "your company has a contract renewal stalling. Your expansion plan is blocked. And the one entity in the country that has both the capital and the strategic interest to help you is run by the woman you just divorced." He picked up his sandwich. "I'm not saying it's comfortable. I'm saying it's practical." Michael said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Get me an invitation." Derek nodded. Just once, like he'd already expected that answer. The invitation arrived 4 days later. A cream-colored envelope embossed edges the kind of weight that communicates significance without saying a word. Michael held it in his hands longer than he should have. He turned it over. He set it on the kitchen counter. He walked away from it and came back 3 times before he opened it. The gala was the 3rd Saturday of the following month. Black tie, the grand ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel in Manhattan, benefiting the National Education Foundation. Northvale International was listed as the event's lead sponsor. Michael set the invitation down. He called Derek. "I'm going," he said. "I figured," Derek said. "Does she know? Is she going to know I'll be there?" "I have no idea what Emily knows," Derek said. "But I'd assume, based on everything you've just learned about your ex-wife, that she probably knows more than either of us expect." Michael hung up and stood in his kitchen for a long moment, staring at the invitation on the counter. The chrome surfaces and clean lines of his redecorated house surrounded him. For the first time, they felt cold rather than modern. For the first time, the silence felt like something other than peace. What Michael did not know as he stood there processing the invitation was that Emily had already been informed of his RSVP. Gerald had mentioned it in passing during their weekly call, the way you mention something minor. "Your ex-husband will be at the New York event," he said. "He's coming with Derek Marsh." Emily had been reviewing a quarterly portfolio summary when Gerald said it. She looked up from the document. "I expected that," she said. "Does it change anything?" She considered the question. Genuinely considered it. Not in the way she might have 3 years ago, when a question like that would have carried emotional weight, would have made her chest tighten and her mind race. But in the quiet, clear way she had learned to consider most things now, directly and without sentiment. "No," she said, "nothing changes." "He may try to approach you," Gerald said, "professionally." "He will definitely try to approach me professionally," Emily said. "And personally, in that order, and then reversed and probably reversed again." She returned her eyes to the document. "It's fine." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" She looked up again, met Gerald's eyes across the video call screen. "Gerald," she said with something that was almost but not quite amusement, "I built $12 billion of infrastructure in the margins of a marriage to a man who didn't know I was doing it. I can handle one awkward event." Gerald smiled. "Fair point," he said. What neither of them discussed, because neither of them needed to, because Emily had long since made peace with the part of herself that still carried the emotional weight of those 8 years, was the fact that seeing Michael again would cost her something. Not her composure, not her position, but something quieter. The specific private pain of being in a room with a person who had looked at you every day for 8 years and never truly seen you. That kind of pain doesn't announce itself. It just sits there still and patient and waits. In the weeks between receiving his invitation and the night of the gala, Michael began doing something he hadn't done in years. He started looking back. It started small. He would be going through files for a meeting and find an old email chain from the early days of his company, and he would notice something: the tone of an introduction letter, the structure of a proposal, the careful, precise language used in a follow-up memo, and realize with a creeping discomfort that he recognized the style. He had never been able to name it before. Now he could. Emily. He found 3 years' worth of business correspondence that had Emily's fingerprints on it, invisible unless you knew what you were looking at. She had never signed those emails. They had gone out under his name, but she had written them, or restructured them, or at the very least had looked at a draft he'd brought home and quietly said, "This part doesn't work. Try it this way." And he had tried it her way, and it had worked, and he had never thought twice about where the improvement had come from, because he hadn't been paying attention, because he had not been the kind of husband or the kind of person who asked. He also found in a folder he hadn't opened since the divorce proceedings the financial documents from the year the bridge loan had appeared. He'd always told himself it was a stroke of luck, the right timing with the right investor. Now he looked at the name of the holding company on those documents with different eyes. RHG Capital Ventures, Rose Harper Group. He sat in his office chair and stared at those 3 letters for a very long time. Then he put his head in his hands, not out of grief exactly, more like the feeling of having been walking in one direction for years, completely certain of your path, and then turning around to discover that the ground behind you was not what you thought it was, that the terrain of your own life had a different shape than the one you'd been mapping. His assistant knocked and asked if he wanted coffee. He said no. She left. He stayed where he was, There is a particular kind of reckoning that comes not from being confronted with something, but from slowly, quietly, undeniably assembling the truth out of pieces that were always there. It is slower than confrontation, and somehow worse, because there is no one to be angry at except yourself. Michael Carter was in the early stages of that reckoning. He did not know yet how far it would go. The week before the gala, Vanessa asked him why he'd been so distant. He told her he was under work pressure. She asked if it had anything to do with Emily. He said no. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, in the way that people look when they sense the answer to a question is not the one they just received. Then she said, "I want to come to New York with you." Michael hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Vanessa caught it. "You don't want me there," she said. "It's a business event," he said. "You'd be bored." "I've been to your business events before." "Vanessa, is she going to be there?" The pause that followed was not long, but it was long enough. "She's the lead sponsor," Michael said. The look that crossed Vanessa's face was not hurt exactly. It was something more complicated, the look of a woman who has just understood something about her relationship that she had been carefully not understanding for several weeks. "I see," she said. "It's not Michael." She held up one hand. "Not dramatic, just firm. Just go. Handle whatever you need to handle. We'll talk when you get back." He left for New York on a Friday morning. He did not know as he sat in the back of the town car on the way to O'Hare that Vanessa was already having a conversation with her sister about what came next. He did not know because he was thinking about Emily, about the gala, about what he was going to say, how he was going to approach her, what version of himself he was going to try to present in a room full of people who now knew exactly who she was. He spent the entire flight preparing for the conversation. He rehearsed it the way people rehearse difficult conversations, running through scenarios, imagining her responses, planning what he would say to each one. He told himself he was ready. He was not ready. Nothing he could have prepared in that airplane seat, nothing he could have planned or rehearsed or imagined could have prepared him for the specific experience of walking into the grand ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel and understanding in one visceral, immediate moment what he had thrown away. It wasn't the size of the room, though it was large. It wasn't the quality of the crowd, though it was extraordinary, the kind of room that contains actual power, not just the performance of it. It wasn't even the way the other guests moved and spoke, the particular ease of people who are entirely comfortable occupying significant space. It was the table placement. Derek had gotten him a seat near the back. Not the very back, not a punishment, but far enough from the front to make clear where he stood in the hierarchy of this particular evening. Far enough that when the lights eventually dimmed and the program began, he would be watching from a distance. He sat down. He ordered a drink. He looked around the room. He saw senators. He saw 2 former cabinet members. He saw the CEO of a company that had been on the front page of every major financial publication for the last 3 years. He saw investors whose names he had read in magazines and whose phone numbers he had tried and failed to obtain through every professional channel available to him. All of them here. All of them in some sense here for her. For the woman who had walked out of that courtroom with one old suitcase. Derek leaned over and said something about the wine, and Michael nodded without hearing a word of it. Because across the room at a table near the front, he had just seen Gerald Cho. And where Gerald Cho was Emily Harper was never far. He looked for her, could not find her. The room was full and the lighting was warm and there were too many people moving between tables. He kept looking. And then the lights shifted. Not dimmed, shifted. A particular quality of attention fell over the room the way it does when something is about to happen. Conversations lowered. Chairs turned. The master of ceremonies stepped to the podium at the front of the room and welcomed everyone with the practiced warmth of someone who does this for a living and genuinely loves it. Michael picked up his glass. He set it down. He picked it up again. And then the MC said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this evening's program will begin with a few words from our lead sponsor, a name that many in this room have known in one form or another for several years, a presence that has shaped many of your portfolios and many of your outcomes in ways you are only now beginning to fully understand." The room was very quiet. "Please join me in welcoming the founder and CEO of Northvale International." A pause. The kind of pause that a skilled communicator uses precisely because they know what comes after it will land harder for the waiting. Emily Rose Harper. Michael Carter's glass slipped from his fingers. It did not shatter the carpet, absorbed most of the impact. but the sound it made was enough to draw a brief glance from Derek beside him and from the two people seated to his left. He did not notice them looking. He was looking at her. Emily Rose Harper walked to the podium in a gown the color of midnight, deep navy clean lines, no ornamentation except for those same small pearl earrings she had worn in the courtroom 3 months ago. Her hair was down. She walked the way she always walked, steadily without hurry, as if there were no distance between where she was and where she was going. She reached the podium. She looked out at the room. And then, before she said a single word, her eyes moved. Just slightly, with the precision of someone who knows exactly where to look. They found Michael Carter at his table near the back of the room, held there for exactly 1 second. Not cold, not triumphant, not anything he could name or have predicted, just clear, the way the eyes of someone look when they are entirely, completely, unshakably themselves. Then she looked back at the room at large, and she began to speak. And Michael Carter sat at his table near the back of the grand ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel, his dropped glass somewhere on the carpet beside him, and for the first time in his adult life, he was absolutely certain of one thing. He had made the worst mistake of his life, and he was only just beginning to understand how deep it went. Emily spoke for exactly 14 minutes, Michael counted. Not because he was tracking the time with any rational intention, but because his mind needed something to hold on to, while the rest of him came apart at the seams. 14 minutes, not a long speech, not a performance designed to impress with volume or flourish. Emily had never been that kind of person, and she was not that kind of speaker. She spoke the way she did everything, with precision, with clarity, and with the particular authority of someone who has nothing left to prove and therefore no reason to perform. She thanked the foundation. She acknowledged the work of the people in the room who had been partners to Northvale over the years, without naming them individually, a courtesy. She said that she hoped they would understand, given how long she had valued the privacy they had extended to her. There was a ripple of knowing laughter from the front tables, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who are in on something. Michael was not in on anything. Michael was sitting at his table near the back of the grand ballroom with his empty hand still curved around the phantom weight of the glass he had dropped, listening to his ex-wife speak to a room full of some of the most powerful people in the country as if she had been doing it her entire life. Because she had been doing it her entire life, he just hadn't known. She spoke about Northvale's mission, about the philosophy behind the way she had chosen to build it, not for visibility, but for durability, not for recognition, but for impact. She said that the most important structures in the world are often the ones you cannot see from the outside, the ones that hold everything else up. She said this without looking in his direction. She said it with the calm certainty of a woman who had lived those words, not just composed them. And then she said something that made the entire room go very still. "There is a particular kind of freedom," Emily said, "that comes from being underestimated. I spent a significant portion of my life inside that freedom. And while I would not trade what it taught me, I want to say tonight clearly and publicly that the women in this room who are still living inside that freedom, the ones who are still being told in one way or another that they are less than what they are, I see you, I was you, and the world will know your names." The room erupted. Not politely, not in the measured, controlled way that formal events usually produce applause, actually erupted the kind of sustained, full-throated response that comes from something landing in a room the way only truth can land. Several people stood, then more, then almost everyone in a wave that moved from the front of the room to the back, like something physical. Michael did not stand. He sat in his chair and listened to the room applaud the woman he had told in front of his own lawyer that she had nothing. Derek Marsh stood beside him, started to say something, looked at Michael's face, stopped. Smart man Derek. When the applause finally settled and the MC returned to the program, Michael became aware of something happening in his chest. A pressure. Not pain, he knew the difference. Something more like the physical sensation of a belief collapsing. Like a building coming down in slow motion, structurally inevitable floor by floor, each one taking longer to fall than the last. He signaled a waiter for another drink. The waiter brought it. Michael drank it faster than he should have. The program continued around him. Other speakers, a video presentation about the Foundation's work, a brief musical interlude, normal gala architecture. None of it touched him. He was somewhere else entirely, not in memory, not in regret yet, but in the strange, suspended space between the moment you understand something and the moment you feel it. 40 minutes after Emily's speech, during a transition between the program's formal segment and the open reception that followed, Derek leaned over. "She's moving to the reception area," he said. "The West Terrace, if you want to—" "I know," Michael said. "You don't have to." "I know that too." He stood up. His legs felt steadier than he expected. That was the thing about Michael Carter. He had a particular physical composure that rarely failed him in public, even when everything else was failing. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his fresh drink. He walked toward the West Terrace with the look of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. He did not know exactly what he was doing. He was running entirely on instinct, and his instincts, as he was beginning to understand, had not always served him well. The West Terrace was full. 100, maybe 120 people clustered in the shifting geometry of a cocktail reception. The way people move at these events, orbiting certain centers of gravity, drifting apart and reforming. Emily was one of the centers. She stood with Gerald Cho and two people Michael didn't recognize. Her posture relaxed, her expression engaged, laughing at something one of them had just said. She was not looking for him. That hit harder than he expected. He had walked in bracing for her to see him immediately, for that charged moment of mutual recognition. Instead, she was simply there in the middle of her own evening, not tracking him at all, which meant she either hadn't seen him yet or had already seen him and decided he was not the most urgent thing in the room. Given what he now knew about Emily Harper, the second option was significantly more likely. He moved through the crowd, stopped to shake two hands he didn't quite track, said something about the speech that someone complimented him for saying, got closer. 12 feet, 8 feet 6. Gerald saw him first. Gerald Cho had the particular quality of attention that comes from years of reading rooms professionally, and he clocked Michael Carter at 6 feet with a look that said he had been expecting this moment and had already decided how to handle it. He touched Emily's arm lightly, and she turned. And there they were. 8 years of marriage, 4 months of divorce, 14 minutes of a speech that had just reordered Michael's entire understanding of his own life, and now 6 feet of carpet between them at a party in Manhattan. Emily looked at him, not through him, not past him, at him, directly and without flinching, the way she had looked at him across the courtroom table when she signed the papers, the way she had always looked at him steadily, as if she could see exactly what was there and had already made her peace with it. "Michael," she said, just his name, nothing attached to it, no warmth, no chill, just the fact of him acknowledged. "Emily," he paused, started again. "You were that speech was—" "Thank you," she said, before he could finish the sentence. Clean and complete. Gerald excused himself with a quiet word and guided the two people beside him away with the smooth expertise of a man who knows when to clear a space. And then it was just the two of them, surrounded by 100 people and entirely alone. Michael took a breath. "Can we find somewhere quieter?" he said. Emily considered him for a moment. "We can talk here," she said. "I won't be long." That landed. He absorbed it. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. And then, because Michael Carter had rehearsed this conversation on a plane for 3 hours, and none of the versions he had rehearsed started the way the real one had started, he abandoned the script entirely and said the thing that was actually true. "I didn't know," he said, "any of it. I didn't know about Northvale. I didn't know about RHG. I didn't know about the bridge loan in year 6. He paused. "I found the documentation. After. I figured it out." Emily looked at him steadily. "Good," she said. "Emily, what do you want me to say, Michael? That I should have told you?" She tilted her head slightly, not with cruelty, but with the particular precision of someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about a question and arrived at a very clear answer. "I gave you 8 years of presence and more financial support than you will ever be able to fully account for. I gave you the time and space to build your career. I gave you the grace of never making you feel threatened by mine. And at the end of all of that, you sat in front of your own lawyer and told him I had nothing." Michael opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not angry," Emily said, and the extraordinary thing was that she genuinely wasn't. The absence of anger in her voice was not suppression or restraint. It was actual peace, the real kind, the kind that only comes from having processed something so completely that the heat has finally gone out of it. I stopped being angry a long time ago. What I am is clear. I'm very clear about what happened and what it meant. I was wrong, Michael said. 3 words almost simple, except nothing about the way he said them was simple. Yes, Emily agreed. No hesitation, no softening of it, just agreement. I need you to know that I understand that now. I believe you, she said, genuinely. I think you do understand it now. She looked at him with that steady, undeflectable gaze. But understanding something after it's already cost everything is very different from understanding it when it mattered. The reception moved around them. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at the far end of the terrace. The city hummed its particular Manhattan hum below and beyond them, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with the conversation happening between 2 people from Chicago who used to share a bed. Michael said, "Is there anything left to talk about between us, I mean? Anything?" "Are you asking me personally or professionally?" Emily said. The question was not rhetorical. It was practical. She wanted to know which conversation she was having so she could give it the correct answer. He hesitated, and that hesitation was its own answer. "I thought so," Emily said not unkindly. "Michael, your company is struggling. I know that. Derek Marsh knows it. You came here because you thought proximity to Northvale might solve a problem." She held his gaze. "Am I wrong?" He wanted to say yes, badly. He wanted to say that he had come here because he needed to see her, because 8 years of marriage deserved a better ending than a smirk in a courtroom, because he had something real to say that had nothing to do with business or leverage or the financial straits his company was navigating. He almost said it. But here was the thing about Michael Carter, the thing that had always been true, and that all of his growth and all of his reckoning had not yet had time to change. He was a man who had spent his entire professional life confusing his wants with his needs and his needs with his strategy. And when Emily asked him that question, what he felt most immediately was not the emotional truth, but the defensive instinct to protect the part of himself that had already been exposed enough tonight. "That's not the only reason," he said. "But it's one of them," Emily said. Silence. "Yes," he admitted. "It's one of them." Emily nodded slowly, just once, as if something she had already known had simply been confirmed. "Then here is my answer to the professional question," she said. "Northvale is not in a position to invest in Carter Tech at this time, not because the company lacks potential, but because the terms of our investment philosophy require that we work with founders whose values align with ours. That's a conversation I'd need to feel confident about before anything else." She paused. "And on the personal question," her voice shifted just slightly, just enough, "I genuinely wish you well, Michael. I mean that. But I don't have anything left that belongs to you. I made sure of that." She extended her hand, a handshake, clean, final. He took it. Her grip was exactly as he remembered, firm, direct, no excess. "Take care of yourself," she said. And then she turned back to the room, and within 30 seconds, Gerald had reappeared at her side, and she was in another conversation, and Michael was standing alone on the west terrace of the Whitmore Hotel, holding an empty glass and the wreckage of every assumption he had ever made about his own life. Derek found him 20 minutes later near the edge of the terrace. "How'd it go?" Derek said. Michael looked at him. "She said no," he said. Derek nodded slowly. "To the investment. To everything," Michael said. There was a pause. "What are you going to do?" Derek asked. Michael looked out at the city, the lights, the movement of it all, the vast, indifferent machinery of a world that had been running perfectly well without him at the center of it. "I don't know yet," he said. And for possibly the first time in years, that answer was honest. What happened next happened fast, in the way that things tend to happen when they have been building for a long time and finally reach the tipping point where the structure can no longer hold. Michael flew back to Chicago the following morning. Vanessa was not at the house when he arrived. There was a note on the kitchen counter, on the same counter where Emily's ceramic bowl used to live, the one he had boxed up and replaced with a sleek, empty surface. The note was brief. Vanessa's handwriting was neat and clear, the way everything about her was neat and clear when it wasn't filtered through charm. It said, "I've had time to think. I think we both know this isn't what either of us thought it would be. I'm staying with my sister for a while. No drama. I just need some space to figure out what I want. V." Michael read the note twice, set it down, looked at the sleek, empty counter, looked at the chrome surfaces and the clean lines and all the careful, expensive redecorating he had done to turn this house into something that felt like the future. He sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, not in collapse. He just sat down the way a person sometimes does when they are very tired and the nearest chair is too far and the floor is simply there. He sat on the kitchen floor of the house he had fought for in the divorce in the middle of a kitchen that no longer felt like a kitchen anyone actually used, and he stayed there for a long time. The silence was enormous. He thought about what Emily had said on the terrace, not the part about Northvale, not the professional answers she had delivered so cleanly and without malice. The other part, the part that had lodged somewhere beneath his ribs and hadn't moved since. Understanding something after it's already cost everything is very different from understanding it when it mattered. He knew she was right. He had known she was right the moment she said it. The question he was sitting with now on the kitchen floor, in the silence in the ruin of two separate versions of the future he had constructed, was what a person does with that understanding when it arrives too late. He did not have an answer. What he had instead was the beginning of something that might eventually become one. 3 days after Michael returned from New York, he received a call from his CFO that moved the situation from difficult to urgent. The contract renewal he had been nursing along for 2 months had officially fallen through. The competitor who had moved into his market space had closed a round of funding large enough to make the next 18 months genuinely precarious for Carter Tech. His CFO, a careful and experienced man named Paul Reedman, who had been with the company for 6 years, laid out the numbers with the grim efficiency of someone who has prepared for an unwelcome conversation and is determined to have it clearly. "We have runway for about 7 months at current burn," Paul said. "After that, we're looking at significant cuts or a funding round. And the funding market right now for companies in our position is tight," Michael said. "Tighter than tight," Paul said. "I've already had preliminary conversations with 4 potential investors. 2 passed immediately. 1 is still in discussion, but the terms are unfavorable. The 4th is a wild card." He paused. "I also want to say something that is outside my normal scope, so tell me if it's unwelcome." "Say it," Michael said. "There are people in the investment community who have already connected the dots between you and Emily Harper," Paul said carefully. "The divorce was public record. Her announcement was significant news. Some investors are," he chose his words precisely, "concerned about the narrative, about what it says about the stability of the company's leadership, that you were married to a financial mind of that caliber for 8 years, and the company is still in this position." The silence that followed was long enough for Paul to clear his throat quietly. "I understand," Michael said finally. "I'm not saying it's fair," Paul said. "I'm saying it's what I'm hearing." After the call ended, Michael sat at his desk for a while. His office had a large window that looked out over the Chicago skyline, and he had always loved that view, had always felt expansive when he looked at it, as if the breadth of the city confirmed something about his own possibilities. Today, it just looked like a lot of buildings. He thought about calling Emily. He picked up his phone 3 times. Each time he put it back down, not because he didn't want to call, but because he was becoming slowly and with considerable difficulty a man who thought before he moved, a man who asked himself what he actually wanted and whether the action he was contemplating served that want or just served his habit. What he wanted when he really sat with it was not another chance with Emily. He understood with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself that what he and Emily had was over in a way that was not cruel, but was completely, permanently final. She had built a world without him in it. It was a better world than the one they had shared, and Emily Rose Harper was not a woman who went backward. What he actually wanted, what he needed, if he was honest, was to become someone who deserved the life he was claiming to want. And he was not that person yet. He was still in too many ways the man who had smirked across the courtroom table, the man who had decorated over the absence of his wife and called it a fresh start, the man who had walked into a New York gala looking for a business solution and called it a personal reckoning. He was not that man completely. He was changing. But change is slower than crisis, and his crisis was moving faster than his growth. The knock on his office door came at 4:17 in the afternoon. His assistant opened it and said there was someone in the lobby, a woman no appointment, who said it was important and personal and that she would wait as long as necessary. Michael frowned. "Did she give a name?" His assistant checked the note she'd taken at the front desk. She said her name is Sandra Cho, she said. She said you don't know her, but you know her husband. Michael was very still. Send her up, he said. Sandra Cho was 61 years old, with the particular elegance of a woman who has lived a full and considered life and is comfortable in every inch of it. She was Gerald Cho's wife, the same Gerald Cho who had spent 20 minutes steering people away from Michael and Emily's conversation on the terrace. The same Gerald Cho who had been Emily's partner and advocate for years. She sat across from Michael in his office with a composure that reminded him painfully and immediately of Emily. I want to be clear that I'm here without my husband's knowledge, she said, and without Emily's knowledge. This is my own initiative, and I take full responsibility for it. All right, Michael said carefully. What can I do for you, Mrs. Cho? I'm not here for you to do anything for me, she said. I'm here because I've known Emily Harper for 4 years. I've watched what your marriage cost her. Not financially, she was always going to be fine financially, but personally. She paused, and her gaze was direct and unhurried. I watched a brilliant, extraordinary woman spend years making herself smaller so that the man she loved could feel larger. I watched her protect your pride at the expense of her own recognition. I watched her grieve that marriage while she was still in it. Another pause. And I watched her rebuild herself on the other side of it with a grace and a strength that most people will never need to find. Michael did not look away from her. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because I was at this gala, Sandra said, and I watched you on that terrace, and I saw something in your face during Emily's speech that I want to believe is real. She folded her hands in her lap. I'm not here to give you another chance with Emily. There is no other chance, and you should accept that completely. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. I'm here because I think you are at a point in your life where you could either become someone fundamentally different, or you could spend the next 20 years making the same mistakes in different rooms. Silence. And you came here to tell me that, Michael said. I came here to tell you, Sandra said, that Emily is not your answer. She never was your answer. She was never supposed to carry you. You carrying yourself, that is the answer. And the fact that a woman of her caliber spent 8 years quietly doing it for you is something you should live with and learn from, not something you should try to leverage into a second act. The word leverage hit him like a door closing, because that was exactly what he had been doing. Even in his most sincere moments, even in the genuine reckoning, he had been slowly undergoing. There had been a corner of his thinking that was already calculating how the story of his growth might become the key to another conversation with Emily, another chance, a different outcome. Sandra Cho had walked into his office and named it in the first 10 minutes. I hear you, he said, and meant it. Good, she said. She stood, extended her hand. Fix your company, Mr. Carter. Not for Emily, not for Vanessa, not for anyone's opinion of you. Fix it because it's yours, and because the people who work for you deserve leadership that shows up for the right reasons. She shook his hand. She left. Michael sat in the silence she left behind and felt something shift, not dramatically, not with any kind of cinematic finality, but in the quiet molecular way that real change actually happens, the kind you don't always notice until you look back from a distance and see where it started. He picked up his phone. This time he didn't call Emily. He called Paul Reedman. Get me a meeting with the wildcard investor, he said, and pull every financial record from the last 8 years, every contract, every loan, every inflection point where the company changed direction. I want to understand exactly how we got here. Paul paused. That's going to take some time. Then start tonight, Michael said. He put the phone down. Outside his window, the Chicago skyline was beginning to darken at the edges, the way it does in the early evening when the sun starts its descent and the city shifts from the bright, ambitious light of the workday into something older and more honest. He looked at it for a long time. I thought about Emily somewhere in this city, or perhaps already on a plane to somewhere else moving through the world, with that particular steadiness that he had spent 8 years mistaking for simplicity. He thought about what it meant to have been so certain for so long about a version of reality that was wrong. He thought about the 8 years he had spent next to a woman who was quietly building an empire, and the 8 years he had spent assuming there was nothing to see. I thought about what Sandra Cho had said. Fix it because it's yours. He had a company. It was struggling. It was salvageable. And for the first time in years, for the first time since he had signed those divorce papers with a smirk and walked out of that courtroom, believing he had the better half of the deal, Michael Carter sat with his own problem without looking for someone else to carry it. It was uncomfortable. It was supposed to be. He opened his laptop. He started to work. The audit took 11 days. Paul Reedman delivered the final summary on a Tuesday morning, setting a thick folder on Michael's desk, with the particular silence of a man who has spent 11 days with difficult numbers and has come to terms with what they mean. He sat across from Michael. He folded his hands. He waited. Michael opened the folder. He read the first page, then the second. He turned pages slowly, the way you turn them when you are hoping the next one will say something different from the last one, even when you already know it won't. His face stayed composed, his breathing stayed even, but his hands by the fourth page had developed a slight tension at the knuckles that Paul noticed and said nothing about. The audit was not just a financial review. Michael had asked for something deeper than that, a full reconstruction of every critical inflection point in the company's history, every moment when Carter Tech had changed direction or recovered from a near collapse, or found resources that shouldn't by the numbers alone have been available. Paul had done exactly that. He had hired 2 outside analysts to assist. He had been thorough, and what the audit revealed, laid out in clean columns and careful annotation, was a story that Michael had been living inside without ever reading it clearly. 4 separate moments in 8 years where the company should have failed. The first was in year 1, a payroll gap that had been bridged by what the records described as a personal loan from a family account. Emily's account. $240,000. The same money she had mentioned that Sunday night at the kitchen table, the money she had called just enough. The money he had promised to repay and never had. The second was in year 3, a structural problem with a vendor contract that had been renegotiated at the last minute in terms so favorable to Carter Tech that the vendor's own legal team had apparently been surprised. The renegotiation had been handled by a consulting intermediary whose parent company Paul's analysts had now traced was RHG Strategies. The third was in year 6, the bridge loan, $400,000 from a holding company that had materialized at precisely the right moment on terms better than anything the market should have offered, RHG Capital Ventures, Rose Harper Group. The fourth was more subtle, and it was the one that hit hardest. In year 7, Carter Tech had won a contract with a mid-sized healthcare technology firm that had become its single most important revenue source for the following 2 years. The contract had come through a referral, a mutual contact in the Chicago investment community who had recommended Carter Tech specifically and enthusiastically. Paul's analysts had traced the referral back through 3 intermediaries to a source that Michael had never known to look for. Emily had recommended his company, without telling him, without asking for credit. To a contact in her network she had simply said, and Paul's analyst had recovered the email chain through a contact at the referring firm, she had simply said, "Carter Tech is worth your time. The product is sound. I believe in it." She had said this 11 months after he had started pulling away from their marriage. 6 months after she had first noticed the changes in him that told her it was ending. She had still said it. Michael closed the folder. He put his hands flat on the desk. He looked at Paul for a long time without speaking. Paul, to his credit, did not fill the silence. Finally, Michael said, "How much total, if you added all up the loans, the consulting, the contracts that came through her network? What's the number?" Paul had prepared for this question. Direct financial support, the personal loan, plus the bridge loan, $640,000, none of which was ever repaid or formally forgiven. He paused. The consulting work through RHG is harder to quantify because the contract renegotiation in year 3 prevented a loss we can only estimate. Conservative figure, somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 in preserved value. Another pause. The healthcare contract generated approximately $4.2 million in revenue over 2 years and opened doors to 3 subsequent contracts worth another $2.8 million. Michael was very still. "And the referral," he said. "Add that in." "The referral precipitated approximately $7 million in revenue directly," Paul said. "Indirectly through the relationships and credibility it established, it's not fully separable from the company's current valuation." Silence. "So without Emily," Michael said. Not a question. A statement he needed to hear himself make. "Without Emily?" Paul confirmed gently. Carter Tech almost certainly does not exist in its current form. There are 2 points in the first 6 years where without intervention we would have been looking at closure or distressed sale. Michael nodded, once, slowly. "Thank you, Paul," he said. "I'll need some time with this." Paul collected his copy of the folder and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back and said something that was outside his professional scope, just as he had warned before. "For what it's worth," Paul said, "she didn't do it for leverage. There's no mechanism in any of these structures that gave her anything in return. She did it because she believed in the company." A beat. "Or because she believed in you. Hard to know which at this point." He left. Michael sat alone in his office and thought about the difference between those 2 things. Believing in the company, believing in him, how much space there was between them and which one he had ever deserved. The call from his bank came that same afternoon at 2:14. The tone of the loan officer's voice was professionally neutral, in the way that professionals are neutral when the news is bad, and they have been trained not to deliver it with anything that could be interpreted as personal feeling. The terms of the existing credit facility were being reviewed. Given current performance metrics and the shifting market conditions in Carter Tech's sector, the bank was initiating a formal reassessment. The loan officer used the word reassessment twice, which in banking language means something closer to concern. Michael thanked him, hung up, sat back in his chair. 7 months of runway, Paul had said. That was before the bank called. With the credit facility under review, the timeline compressed. Realistically, he was looking at 4 months, maybe 5, before the decision stopped being strategic and started being desperate. I thought about calling Derek. He thought about calling the wildcard investor Paul had mentioned. He thought about the various levers available to him and measured each one against the reality Paul had laid out that morning. And then he thought about something Sandra Cho had said in his office the week before. "Fix it because it's yours." He picked up the phone. He did not call Derek. He called his head of product development, a 34-year-old engineer named Kira Okafor, who had been with Carter Tech for 4 years and who had on 3 separate occasions, that Michael now recognized clearly, in hindsight, tried to redirect the company's development roadmap in a direction he had dismissed as too conservative. Kira answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," Michael said, "about the direction we should have taken in year 5. There was a brief silence. "I'm listening," Kira said. They talked for 2.5 hours. What Kira laid out in the organized, evidence-based way she had apparently been sitting on for years, waiting for someone to ask, was a product pivot that addressed a narrower market with significantly higher margins than the broad consumer play Michael had been chasing. It was less flashy. It was considerably more viable. It was, Michael admitted to himself, as Kira walked through the numbers, almost exactly what Emily had suggested in passing once about 3 years ago over dinner. He had not listened then. He was listening now. "How long to implement a meaningful version of this?" Michael asked. "With the right resources, 90 days for a viable prototype," Kira said. "The groundwork is mostly there. I've been quietly maintaining a development thread on this architecture for about 18 months. Michael stopped. 18 months, he said. "I know you hadn't approved it officially," Kira said carefully. "I kept it small, 2 engineers, off the main roadmap. I thought there might come a moment when it was relevant." Michael looked at the ceiling of his office. He had a CFO who had been quietly maintaining financial clarity in the background, a head of product who had been quietly maintaining a development alternative in the background, and an ex-wife who had been quietly maintaining the financial survival of his entire enterprise in the background. He had surrounded himself apparently with people who knew more than he did, and had chosen to continue working with him anyway. People who had seen what he couldn't see and had held the space open for him to eventually get there. "What would you need from me?" he said to Kira. "Clarity," she said. "Just tell me this is real and I'll move." "It's real," Michael said. "Then I'll start tonight," she said. He put the phone down. For the second time in 2 weeks, Michael Carter opened his laptop and started to work, but this time the work felt different. Not frantic, not defensive, not the motion of a man running from a collapsing structure. The motion of a man beginning slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, to build something he actually understood. 3 weeks later, Emily was in San Francisco. She had meetings with 2 technology firms on Monday and a board session with Northvale's West Coast Advisory Group on Wednesday. The in-between time she used the way she always used it, efficiently and without waste. She slept well. She ate properly. She walked in the mornings before her schedule began because she had learned long ago that the body needs movement to process what the mind is working through. She was on one of those morning walks when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was from Chicago, not a saved contact, but she recognized the area code, and something about the specific sequence of digits was familiar in the way that certain numbers stay embedded in the memory, regardless of how deliberately you try to release them. She answered. "Emily," Michael's voice, careful, like a man who has rehearsed the first word and is not certain of the second. "Michael," she said. She kept walking. "I know you said everything you needed to say in New York," he began. "I did," she confirmed. "I'm not calling to reopen that conversation," he said. "I'm calling because I had an audit done of the company's history, the full picture." A pause. "I know about the bridge loan. I know about the year 3 contract renegotiation. I know about the referral in year 7. Emily said nothing. She kept her pace steady. "I know what you did," Michael said. "All of it. The number. The scope of it." His voice was quieter now. "I don't have any right to call you. I know that. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now, the whole picture, and I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." The word sorry sat in the air between Chicago and San Francisco, carried by a phone signal across 2 time zones, and Emily let it sit there for a moment before she responded. "I hear you," she said. "That's all," he said, not bitterly, with genuine uncertainty. The uncertainty of a man who has done the work of arriving at an apology and isn't sure what an apology is supposed to feel like when it's real. "What else would you like?" she asked. "I don't know. Absolution, maybe," he said. "I know that's not yours to give." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." She stopped walking. She was at the edge of a small park, the kind of space that cities tuck between larger structures, improbably green and still. She stood at the edge of it and looked at the trees. "Michael," she said, "I did those things because I wanted to, not because you asked or because I expected credit. I believed in the company. I believed in what it could become. I chose to support it." "Why?" he said. "Even in year 7, when you already knew the marriage was—" "Because it was the right thing to do," she said, simply, without drama. "And because I had the ability to do it, and I wasn't willing to let people lose their jobs over a problem I could solve quietly. Your employees didn't deserve to pay for the problems in our marriage." There was a long silence. "You're an extraordinary person," Michael said, and it was not a compliment deployed with strategy. It was the plain, exhausted truth of a man saying something he should have said years ago. "I'm someone who made choices," Emily said, "the same way you made choices. The difference is that mine came from understanding what mattered, and yours came from not looking closely enough to find out." She paused. "You're looking now. That matters. It's just a different chapter." "A different chapter for who?" he said. "For you," she said. "This is your chapter, Michael. I'm in mine." She heard him breathe. "Your company," she said. "Is it going to survive?" I was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. We're pivoting. There's a product direction that might work. My head of product has been quietly maintaining it for 18 months. He gave a small wry sound that was almost a laugh. "Apparently everyone around me has been quietly maintaining things I should have been paying attention to." "That sounds familiar," Emily said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite amusement and not quite sorrow, something in between that held both. "I know," he said. "Good luck with the pivot," she said. "I mean that." "I know you do," he said. "That's the part that—" He stopped. Started again. "That's the part that's hardest to sit with, actually, knowing that you mean it." "Sit with it," she said. "You'll be okay." She ended the call. She stood at the edge of the small park for another minute. The trees moved slightly. Somewhere nearby, a car passed. The morning continued the way mornings do, indifferent to the weight of what had just happened, moving at its own pace. She put her phone in her pocket. She kept walking. What she did not tell Michael, what she had no reason to tell him, and what belonged entirely to her, was that the call had cost her something. Not a lot. Not the way it might have cost her a year ago or 2 years ago, when the wound was still raw, and the grief of those 8 years was still something she carried visibly. But something. A small, quiet expenditure of the emotional reserves that she had been carefully rebuilding since the divorce. The reserves that no one on a Northvale board call or at a New York gala would ever see, because she had built the same careful wall around them that she built around everything that mattered. She was not broken. She was not even particularly shaken. But she was human. And Michael had been 8 years of her life, and no amount of clarity or peace or correct understanding of who she was and what she deserved could fully eliminate the specific ache of having loved someone and watched them fail to love you back in the way you deserved. She walked for another 20 minutes. Then she went back to her hotel, made tea, opened her laptop, and started her day. Because that was what Emily Harper did. She felt what there was to feel, she gave it the time it needed, and then she moved. Back in Chicago. Michael put his phone down and sat at his kitchen table. Not the office desk, the kitchen table. The same table where Emily had once sat across from him on a Sunday night and handed him her savings without hesitation. He had replaced the table during the redecorating. This was a different table, sleeker, more expensive, made of materials that would not show wear. He sat at it anyway. He thought about what she had said. "This is your chapter, Michael. I'm in mine." He had spent the past month slowly, painfully understanding what he had lost. He was now beginning the slower and perhaps more important process of understanding what he had left. He had a company in the middle of a pivot that might save it or might not. He had a head of product who had been waiting 4 years for someone to ask the right question. He had a CFO who had been quietly building clarity in the background. He had, in other words, people who still believed the company was worth saving, and that belief had survived despite the fact that it had been working against significant leadership deficits for years. He also had somewhere in the private accounting of the man he was becoming the knowledge of what an extraordinary woman had done for him when she had no obligation to do it, not as a debt, not as a weight, but as a standard, a benchmark, a model of what it looked like to choose to help someone because it was right and not because the return was guaranteed. He wanted to be that kind of person. He was not there yet, but he was starting to understand what the direction looked like. The investor meeting happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the phone call to Kira and 2 weeks after the call to Emily. The wild card Paul had mentioned turned out to be a woman named Jean Hardcastle, 64 years old, founder of a growth equity firm that specialized in technology companies in transition. She was not warm in the way that some investors perform warmth. She was direct, focused, and interested in exactly 2 things: the quality of the product and the honesty of the leadership. She had requested this meeting after reading Carter Tech's preliminary pivot presentation. She had not requested it through intermediaries. She had called Paul's office directly and said she had 45 minutes on Thursday, and would Michael Carter please bring his head of product. Michael brought Kira. Kira, who had never been in an investor meeting of this kind, arrived in a gray blazer and flat shoes and answered every question Jean Hardcastle asked with the organized, evidence-based clarity of someone who has been waiting for years to be taken seriously in this exact context. 40 minutes into the meeting, Jean Hardcastle looked at Michael and said, "Your product person is exceptional. How long has she been with the company?" 4 years, Michael said. "And this architecture she's been quietly maintaining, you approved that?" A pause. Michael said, "No, I didn't. She did it on her own initiative because she believed it was the right direction. I've spent the past few weeks coming to understand that she was correct." Jean looked at him for a moment. "That's an unusually honest answer," she said. "I've been practicing honesty recently," Michael said. "It's harder than it sounds." Jean Hardcastle almost smiled. It was brief and controlled, but it was there. "I'll tell you what I think," she said, putting her pen down on the table. "I think your company has been operating below its potential because of a leadership style that has historically prioritized appearance over substance. I think you have come to a point, whether by choice or by circumstance, probably both, where that pattern is changing." She looked at Kira. "And I think your head of product has been carrying technical clarity for this company for longer than she should have had to, which means the infrastructure is better than the recent history suggests." She looked back at Michael. "I'm interested. The terms won't be generous, but they'll be fair. And fair at this point should be what you're looking for." Michael nodded. "Fair is exactly what I'm looking for," he said. It was the truest thing he had said in a business meeting in years. The terms took another 2 weeks to negotiate. Paul handled most of it, with Hardcastle's team coming back to Michael at each stage, with updates that Michael reviewed more carefully than he had reviewed anything in a long time. He did not rush the process. He did not try to charm his way through it. He asked questions, he listened to answers, and he made decisions based on what was actually in front of him, rather than on what he wished were true. On the Friday that the term sheet was finalized, Michael sat in his office after everyone else had gone home and let himself feel something he had not felt in months. Not triumph, something quieter, steadier. The feeling of having done a hard thing correctly, of having earned something in the way that actually meant earning it. He thought about calling someone to share it with. His list was shorter than it used to be. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring because she always did, because she had always been the kind of parent who stayed reachable. She listened to him describe the term sheet in broad terms, and when he was done, she said, "You sound different." "I am different," he said. "Good different." He thought about it, really thought about it the way the new version of him was learning to think about things. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Finally." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Michael, I've been wanting to ask you something for a while, about Emily." He braced slightly. "Okay. Did you know, when you were married to her, any of it her work what she was building?" "No," he said. "I didn't know." "Why not?" He considered the question. "Because I didn't ask," he said. "And I didn't ask because I didn't think there was anything to ask about." "Why didn't you think that?" "Because I had decided who she was," he said. "Early, and I stopped looking after that." His mother said nothing for a moment. "That's an honest answer," she said finally. "Someone told me recently that I should practice honesty," he said. "I'm trying." "Who told you that?" "A woman named Jean Hardcastle," he said, "and before her a woman named Sandra Cho, and before her Emily herself on a terrace in New York." He paused. "It seems the most useful things I've learned in the past few months have all come from women I initially underestimated." His mother let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "Michael," she said, and her voice was full of a mother's particular mixture of exasperation and love. "What are you going to do about that?" "Keep listening," he said. That was for the first time in a long time exactly the right answer. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a dramatic reversal. It was not the kind of turnaround that makes headlines or gets written up in business magazines with triumphant language. It was something more ordinary and more durable than that. Kira's team built the prototype in 86 days, 3 days ahead of schedule. The preliminary response from the 3 test clients Paul had quietly approached was positive, not explosively sustainably positive. The kind of positive that builds rather than bursts. Jean Hardcastle's investment closed on a Wednesday morning. Michael signed the paperwork in a conference room with Paul and Kira and Jean's lead associate, and afterward they went to a diner 2 blocks from the office and had coffee and eggs and talked about what the next 6 months would require. No champagne, no celebration dinner, just coffee and eggs and honest conversation about the work ahead. It was the best business meal Michael had had in years. He paid the check. On the way back to the office, walking beside Kira along the Chicago sidewalk in the particular crisp air of an autumn morning, Kira said something she had never said to him before. "I want you to know," she said, "that I almost left last spring. I had an offer from another company and I was seriously considering it." Michael looked at her. "What made you stay?" he said. She thought about it. "I still believed the product could become something," she said. "And I thought there might be a version of this company worth staying for. I just wasn't sure the leadership would ever get out of its own way long enough to find it." "And now," he said. She looked at him steadily with the same direct, organized clarity she brought to everything. "Now I think it might," she said. He nodded. They walked. And somewhere across the country in a city Michael couldn't see, and a chapter he was not part of, Emily Rose Harper was building the next phase of something extraordinary, not because she had survived him, not because she had proven anything to anyone who doubted her, but because this was simply who she was. A woman who built. A woman who saw what others missed. A woman who had spent years making herself invisible, not because she lacked confidence, but because she had been trying to protect something that ultimately could not be protected that way. She had stopped trying to protect it, and in the stopping she had become fully, finally, irrevocably herself. The world was still catching up. The article ran on a Tuesday. Not a financial trade publication. Not an investment newsletter with a narrow readership of people who already knew Emily's name. A major national magazine, the kind that sits on waiting room tables and airport newsstands, the kind that reaches people who have never attended a gala or read a term sheet in their lives. The cover story. Her photograph on the front. No dramatic styling, no forced power pose. Just Emily in a clean blazer looking directly at the camera with the expression that anyone who had spent more than 10 minutes with her would recognize immediately calm, direct, and entirely unimpressed by the weight of the moment. The headline read The Architect, How Emily Rose Harper Built a $12 billion empire while the world wasn't looking. Gerald Cho saw it first at 6:40 in the morning when a Google alert on his phone produced the link, and he clicked it while still in bed. He read the opening 3 paragraphs, sat up and said to his wife, "It's happening." Sandra, who had been awake for 20 minutes and was already on her second cup of tea, said without looking up from her own phone, "I know, I'm reading it now." Emily herself did not see it until 8:15 because she had been on a 7 o'clock call with Northvale's legal team about the finalization of a partnership agreement with a European technology consortium that had been in negotiation for 4 months. When the call ended, her assistant, a methodical 30-year-old named Priya, who had been with her for 2 years and who had an almost supernatural ability to manage information flow without adding noise to it, came into her office and set a printed copy of the article on her desk. "It's good," Priya said simply. Emily picked it up. Read it the way she read everything. Not quickly, not emotionally, but with full attention, absorbing every word for what it actually said rather than what she wanted it to say or feared it might. The journalist had done real work. She had interviewed Gerald, 3 of the investors who had worked with Northvale in its anonymous Phase 2 former colleagues from Emily's time at Harlow Capital, and Emily herself in a 2-hour conversation that had taken place 6 weeks earlier, and that Emily had agreed to with the understanding that the story would be told accurately, not heroically. It was told accurately. That was actually rarer than it should have been, and Emily noted it with quiet appreciation. The article did not mention Michael by name. The journalist had asked carefully and professionally whether the marriage and divorce were relevant to the story. Emily had said, "The marriage is part of my biography. The divorce was a transition. Neither one is the story." The journalist had honored that. What the article said in a single careful paragraph was that Emily had made a deliberate choice during a significant period of her personal life to operate invisibly, and that this choice, while it had cost her years of public recognition, had also given her the freedom to build without the interference of expectation. It was accurate. It was the truth. It gave nothing away that Emily had not chosen to give. She set the article down on her desk. "Any calls yet?" she said to Priya. 47 emails since 6 this morning, Priya said. 3 calls from media requesting follow-up interviews, 2 from investment firms requesting meetings, 1 from your college asking if you'd consider speaking at the spring commencement. She paused. And 1 from a number in Chicago that isn't saved in your contacts, which came in at 7:52 and left no voicemail. Emily looked at her. "Forward me the emails," she said. "Schedule the college response as a low priority for this week. The investment firms have Gerald screen them." She paused. "The Chicago number, I'll handle that myself." Priya nodded and left. Emily looked at the article one more time. Then she looked at the photograph of herself on the cover. She studied it the way you study a photograph of someone you know well, but have not seen in a while, checking it for accuracy, measuring it against the internal version you carry. The woman in the photograph looked like someone who had arrived somewhere. Emily knew the truth was more complicated than that. Arrival was a story people told about other people to make the journey feel conclusive. The real experience was not arrival, it was continuation. She had not arrived anywhere. She was still moving, still building, still becoming the fullest version of the thing she had been working toward. The magazine cover was a moment in that motion, not the destination of it. She picked up her phone. She dialed the Chicago number. It rang twice. "Emily." Michael's voice was not the voice of a man who was surprised she had called back. It was the voice of a man who had hoped she would and had not been certain. "You called," she said. "I saw the article," he said. "Most people did," she said. A pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted. The kind of pause that happens between 2 people who have said the most important things already and are now navigating what comes after. "I wanted to say congratulations," Michael said. "And I know that might sound—" "Michael," her voice was even. "It sounds fine, thank you." "It's a remarkable story," he said. Reading it, the full scope of it laid out the way she laid it out. He stopped, tried again. "I knew pieces of it. After the audit, I thought I understood. Reading that article, I realized I still hadn't fully—" He stopped again. "It's a lot to absorb," Emily said. "It is," he said, and then quietly, "You deserved that story a long time ago." She said nothing for a moment. "Yes," she said finally, "I did." "How does it feel?" he asked, "having it out there, having people know?" Emily considered the question honestly. "Lighter," she said. "Mostly lighter. There's a part of it that takes some getting used to. Being seen after being invisible for so long has its own adjustment." She paused. "But mostly lighter." "Good," Michael said. "That's good." He seemed to hesitate. "The company is doing better. I wanted you to know that too. The pivot is working. Kira's prototype had its first real client demo last week, and the response was, it was what we needed." "I'm glad," Emily said. "I know you are," he said. And there was no bitterness in it, just recognition, the recognition of a man who had finally fully understood something about the woman he had been married to. "That's one of the things I've had to sit with, actually, knowing that you're genuinely glad for things that have nothing to benefit you." "It's not complicated," Emily said. "People can want good things for each other without there being an angle." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't always." The call lasted 6 more minutes. They talked about nothing of great consequence: the Chicago weather, a restaurant near his office that had closed after 12 years, a small and ordinary exchange of the kind that two people have when they have moved past the weight of their shared history and arrived at something that is not friendship exactly, and is not closure exactly, but is somewhere in between. Something that is in its own way enough. When the call ended, Emily set her phone down and sat for a moment in the particular quality of quiet that follows the ending of something that needed to end. Then she pulled up the European Partnership Agreement and got back to work. The commencement invitation, as it turned out, was not a low priority for long. Emily's assistant scheduled a call with the college the following week, and the person on the other end of that call explained that the invitation was not routine. The commencement was Northwestern's spring ceremony. Emily's own alma mater and the student body had specifically requested her by name after the magazine article ran. Not the administration's choice. The students. A petition apparently had circulated within 48 hours of the article's publication and had gathered over 3,000 signatures before the administration made the official call. Emily listened to this information in silence. Priya, who was sitting in on the call to take notes, looked up from her laptop when Emily didn't respond immediately. Emily caught her eye and gave a small nod that meant continue. The college administrator continued. "We understand you've been selective about public appearances," she said carefully. "We want to be respectful of your schedule and your preferences. But we did want you to know that this came from the students themselves. From young women in particular, many of whom have written to us about what your story has meant to them personally." Emily said, "Send me the petition." The administrator sent it that afternoon. Emily read it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow because she kept forgetting to drink it. She read every comment attached to the petition, all 3,200 of them. It took her 2.5 hours. Some of them were brief, short expressions of admiration, the kind of thing people write when they are moved but not sure how to articulate the movement. Others were longer, detailed, personal. A junior in the economics department who had been told by a professor that her analytical style was too cautious to succeed in competitive finance. A senior in the business school who had been passed over for an internship that she later learned had gone to a less qualified male classmate. A graduate student who had spent 3 years watching her ideas get attributed to the men in her research group and had been told when she raised it that she was being oversensitive. They had all read the article about Emily Harper. They had all seen their own experience reflected in it. And they had all in their own words wanted to say, "We needed to know this was possible." Emily set her phone down when she finished reading. She looked at her cold tea. She thought about something that she had never told. Gerald had never told Sandra, had not said to Michael, had not said to the journalist, had not said in the 14-minute speech at the New York Gala. A thing she had carried privately the way she carried most true things. She had been that junior. She had been that senior. She had been that graduate student in her own version of those experiences in the early years of her career and in the quieter ways inside her marriage. She had been looked past and spoken over and underestimated, not always dramatically, not always with malice, but consistently and cumulatively in the way that water shapes stone. Not by breaking it, just by being there steady and repetitive until the shape of the thing changes. She had not let it break her. but she had let it make her invisible partly by choice and partly by necessity. And there was a version of that invisibility she had never quite finished grieving. Reading those 3,000 comments, she found that version of herself in every page, and she felt something she did not expect to feel. Not sorrow, not pride either, something that was neither of those and contained both. She picked up her phone. She called Priya. "Tell them yes," she said. Priya said, "I'll let them know first thing tomorrow." "Tonight," Emily said. "Tell them tonight." There was a brief pause, and Emily could hear the smile in Priya's voice when she said, "Yes, tonight." The commencement was 8 weeks later on a Saturday in late May, and the morning of it, Emily sat in a small preparation room off the main stage and let herself be present in the way she rarely allowed herself to be present, not planning, not processing, not working toward the next thing. Just here, just this. Gerald knocked and came in. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Gerald had a quality when the moment called for it of simply being quiet in a way that felt full rather than empty. It was one of the things Emily had always valued about their partnership. "How are you?" he said finally. "Honest answer," she said. "Always." "Terrified," she said, "and completely certain I should be here. Both of those things at the same time." Gerald nodded. "That's usually what the right things feel like," he said. She smiled. A real one, full and unguarded, the same smile she had given him on the day they incorporated Northvale International, and he had said the world would have to do some serious recalibrating. "It's overdue," she said. And he remembered. His smile matched hers. Emily's commencement address lasted 22 minutes. She did not read from notes. She had written out a full draft, revised it twice, read it aloud to herself 3 times in her apartment at 6 in the morning over 2 consecutive days. Then she had set it aside, because what she wanted to say to those students, what she needed to say, was not something she could deliver correctly from a page. It needed to come from the place where she had lived it, the place that was not polished or curated or managed. She began by telling them the truth. Not all of it, not the specific names or the specific numbers or the particular choreography of her marriage and her divorce, and the $12 billion she had built in the margins of a life that had not been designed to hold it. But the essential truth, the kind that exists underneath the facts. She said, "For a significant period of my career, I made myself invisible, not because I lacked confidence, and not because I was afraid, though I was sometimes afraid. I made myself invisible because I was trying to protect something that I loved, and I had been taught in 100 subtle ways that the most efficient way to protect something was to make sure no one could see it. I had been taught that visibility was a threat, that being seen was a risk." She paused. "That lesson was wrong. It cost me years that I will not get back. And the most important thing I want to say to you today is this: you are not responsible for managing other people's comfort with your excellence." The room was very quiet. She kept going. "There will be people in your life, and I say this not with bitterness, but with the clarity of experience, who will be more comfortable with a diminished version of you, who will respond to your full capacity with something that looks like discomfort or dismissal, or the particular kind of condescension that comes from someone who has decided who you are before you ever had the chance to show them." She looked out at the rows of graduating students. "Let them be uncomfortable. That is not your problem to solve. Your only problem is to keep becoming the person you actually are, fully, without apology, without management of anyone else's expectations." In the 3rd row, a young woman in the economics department, who had once been told her analytical style was too cautious, pressed her hands together and looked at the stage and did not blink. In the 7th row, a senior in the business school who had been passed over for an internship thought about the job offer she had accepted last week, a better job from a better company, and felt the specific vindication of someone who had waited without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. Emily spoke for 14 more minutes. She talked about the difference between ambition and endurance. She talked about the particular courage required to do work that no one is watching, to build something in the dark without the validation of immediate recognition. She talked about what it means to know your own value so thoroughly that you do not need anyone else to confirm it. And near the end, she said something that she had not planned to say, something that arrived the way the truest things arrive, without announcement from the deepest part of the place where they had been living. 8 years ago, she said, someone told me that without him I had nothing. He said it in front of witnesses with confidence, and at the time I believe he genuinely thought it was true. She paused. I want you to understand something about that moment. I did not argue. I did not fight. I did not stand in that room and list my accomplishments or defend my worth, because I already knew what I was. I had always known. And the opinion of someone who had never taken the time to find out that opinion had no power over the truth I carried. She looked out at the room. Know what you are. Not what people tell you, not what the room expects, what you actually are. Carry it like the foundation it is, because the day will come when the world catches up, and when it does, you will not need to announce yourself. The room will simply go quiet. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. Then the room came apart. Not politely, not in the measured formal way that commencement ceremonies usually produce applause. The way a room comes apart when something real has been said in it. Emily stood at the podium and received it. She did not deflect. She did not rush to the next thing. She simply stood there in her own name, in her own light, and let the recognition land, fully and without apology. It was for Emily Rose Harper, a new experience. After 12 years of building in the dark, she was finally letting herself be seen. And it felt exactly like what Gerald had said. It felt like what the right things feel like. The magazine article had been read by millions of people. The commencement address, recorded and uploaded to multiple platforms, was watched by millions more in the weeks that followed. Emily did not track the numbers. Priya tracked them and gave weekly summaries that Emily read and then set aside, because what mattered to her was not the scale of the audience, but the quality of the work, and the work, the actual daily work of Northvale, the investments, the partnerships. The decisions continued at its own pace, rigorous and deliberate and fundamentally unchanged by the attention surrounding it. What did change was the foundation she had announced at the gala, which had in the weeks following the article received applications from over 400 women seeking early-stage support for ventures in technology, finance, and related fields. Emily and Gerald had budgeted the first year's operations at $15 million. They revised that number upward within the first month because $15 million was not going to be enough. The selection process was Emily's personal project. She reviewed every application herself, or at least the first 2 pages of each one, enough to find the signal in the noise, enough to identify the quality of thinking that she recognized because she had once carried it herself in the margins of someone else's life. She stayed up late on Tuesday nights going through the pile. Priya brought her tea. The apartment was quiet. She found 43 women in the first cohort. 43 women who had been told in one way or another that they were less than what they were. 43 women who had been building anyway in the dark, without recognition, with the specific and undefeated clarity of someone who knows what they are, regardless of what the room decides. She called each of them personally, not to pitch the foundation's support, not to explain the terms or the process, just to say, I read your application. I see what you're building. I believe it is worth building. That was all. That was enough. Those calls, more than the magazine cover, more than the commencement address, more than any of the public moments that the world had begun to attach to her name, those calls were the work she was most proud of, because they were not visible, they were not strategic, they were simply right. Michael Carter heard about the foundation through Derek Marsh, who mentioned it over lunch one afternoon about 4 months after the article ran. Michael listened, asked a few questions about the structure of it, said nothing of great consequence, and then went back to his office and made a donation to the foundation's general fund that was larger than Derek would have expected, and that Emily never knew came from him. He did not include a note. He did not want acknowledgement. He wanted, in the small and private way that was available to him, to contribute to something she had built, the way she had once contributed to something he had built quietly and without a return. It was not a redemption. It was not even close to sufficient accounting for everything the audit had shown, but it was a true thing. And true things done without an audience and without expectation are the beginning of character. Not the evidence of it, the beginning. Carter Tech's pivot continued to gain traction through the winter. The prototype became a product. The product found its first paying clients. The clients became a reference base. The reference base opened conversations with 3 larger enterprises that would, if they converted, shift the company from precarious to stable in a matter of months. Michael did not let himself get ahead of the numbers. He checked them with Paul every week. He sat with Kira in product reviews every other week. He asked questions he previously would have delegated. He admitted uncertainty in meetings where he previously would have performed confidence. He made 2 decisions that he knew were right, and that cost him short-term relationships with people who had only ever valued his company when it looked like it was winning. He let those relationships go. I was learning slowly, and with the particular humility of a man who has come to it late, that not every connection is worth preserving. That the value of a relationship is measured not in what it provides during the good periods, but in what it requires during the difficult ones. Emily had understood this for years. He was catching up. Vanessa, for her part, had made a decision of her own. She and Michael had talked twice after her note on the kitchen counter. Real conversations, honest ones, without the performance of civility, masking something harder underneath. She had said in the second of those conversations that she thought they had both known for a while that what they had was not built on the right foundation. She said it without blame and without drama, and Michael had appreciated that more than he could express. He had agreed. They had ended it cleanly. She had moved on to something that suited her better. He had let her go without the kind of self-serving grief that is really just ego wearing sadness as a coat. I was alone in the house for the first time in years. It was uncomfortable. It was also, he was surprised to discover, clarifying. He started cooking his own meals. Not elaborate ones. He was not built for the kind of cooking that requires patience and technique. But simple things. Eggs in the morning, soup on Sunday. The particular small satisfaction of feeding yourself, of taking care of the basic things without delegating them or performing them for an audience. It reminded him in a way he could not entirely articulate of something Emily had once said to him in the early years of their marriage. She had been making dinner after a long day, and he had asked why she didn't just order in. She had said, because taking care of yourself is a practice, not a convenience. He had not understood what she meant then. He understood now. I thought about Emily less often than he had in the months immediately following the divorce, and when he thought about her, the quality of those thoughts had changed. Less guilt, less longing, something more like gratitude, the clean kind without self-pity attached to it. Gratitude for the 8 years, even for the worst parts, because the worst parts had been the ones that eventually forced him to look at himself clearly. Gratitude for who she was, because understanding what he had been living next to without seeing it had given him the most accurate measure he had ever had of how far he still had to go. How was going? That was the difference. A year after the divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in October, Emily sat at her kitchen table with her tea and her laptop and the particular quiet of an early morning that belongs entirely to herself, and she thought about the year. She thought about the gala and the magazine cover and the commencement address. She thought about the 43 women in the foundation's first cohort, 4 of whom had already reached milestones significant enough to warrant new conversations about additional support. She thought about the European partnership and the 2 new board members she had added to Northvale's advisory structure, and the quarterly review she had coming up on Thursday that she was, for the first time in years, genuinely looking forward to rather than managing toward. She thought about Michael's call after the article. She thought about the bridge loan and the referral and the RHG documents and the Year 7 renegotiation. She thought about the Sunday night at the kitchen table when she had handed over her savings without hesitation because she had believed in that moment that what helped him helped them. She had been wrong about the them. She had not been wrong about the help. She thought about being 23 years old at Harlow Capital running numbers at a table in the corner while men in better suits discussed the results of her analysis without attributing it to her. She thought about the 30 years of life between that moment and this one, and about all the things she had built and lost and rebuilt and learned and carried and finally set down. She opened her laptop. Priya had sent the morning summary at 6:15 as always. 42 items organized by urgency. Emily scrolled through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to move through information without being consumed by it. At the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, Priya had added a single line, "Saw the quarterly foundation impact numbers this morning. Wanted you to see them before the formal report." Below the line, a single figure. The 43 women in the first cohort had collectively in 9 months generated over $31 million in revenue across their ventures, hired 214 employees, and received follow-on investment totaling 4 times the initial support they had received from the foundation. Emily read the number, read it again, set down her tea. And then she did something she almost never did in the mornings before the day began, and the work took over, and the world resumed its expectations of her. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. She let herself feel at the full, unmanaged weight of what it meant to have built something that was building other things. This was the empire she had actually wanted. Not the $12 billion, though. The $12 billion was real and was hers, and she was not foolish enough to pretend it didn't matter. But these $31 million spread across 43 tables in 43 cities where 43 women were doing their best work and being seen doing it. This was the thing underneath the thing, the architecture that had always been the point. She had told Gerald years ago, on the day they incorporated Northvale International, that the most important structures in the world are often the ones you cannot see from the outside. She had built one, and then she had used it to make sure other people could be seen. She picked up her tea, finished it, stood up, walked to her window and looked at the morning, which was doing what mornings do, arriving completely without apology, indifferent to whether the world was ready for it. Emily Rose Harper was ready. She had been ready for a long time. The difference now was that the world finally knew it. And the woman who had once been told she had nothing, the woman who had signed her name in a courtroom and walked out with one old suitcase and a silence full of everything, stood in her own mourning, in her own name, in the full and undiminished light of everything she had always been. She had not won by defeating anyone. She had won by refusing to disappear. And that in the end was the only victory that had ever mattered.